Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Meryl Richards. I'm the moderator for today's webinar on addressing risks to farmers and farm workers in climate transition plans in the food sector. I'm a director of research on the food and forest team here at Ceres, which is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. So just a few notes on logistics before we get started this morning. The session is being recorded and live streamed on LinkedIn and Twitter, and we'll be providing all the participants with a link to the recording shortly after its completion. So if you have colleagues who couldn't tune in or you have to hop off early yourself, there will be a recording. We will also have time for audience Q&A later during the session. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation or discussion, you can put them into the Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll do our best to answer those. And same if you have a technical question, trouble with audio, etc., please type that into the Q&A box and we'll try to get you sorted out. So I want to thank our speakers, thank each of you for participating in today's event, and I'm especially grateful to Dr. AnnaMaria and Marybeth Gallagher for joining us to share their views and experiences. AnnaMaria is Research Director of Climate Action for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. Marybeth is the Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments, and I will introduce them more thoroughly just before our panel discussion. Today, next slide. Thanks, and you can actually go to the next slide. Today's series is launching a report on addressing risks to farmers and farm workers in climate transition plans in the U.S. food sector. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time discussing why we're releasing this report, some of the key messages. Then we'll transition to a panel discussion with AnnaMaria and Marybeth, who'll tell us a little bit more about why addressing risks and impacts to farmers and farm workers is so key in corporate climate transition plans, what food companies can do, and how investors can engage with companies on this topic. Before we dive in, I'd like to note that where I sit, I'm currently in northwestern Vermont. The first farmers here were and are the Abenaki Nation and people, and this is their sovereign homeland. And I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous people in the US and globally who've stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. They are the originators of regenerative agriculture. And we do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. Next slide, Rachel. So as most of you know, customers and investors are increasingly calling on companies to develop climate transition plans. And despite the anti-ESG backlash, at least here in the US, it's well established that integrating financial impacts of climate change and other sustainability issues into decision-making is sound investment in business practice. There's also increasing recognition that the climate transition is an opportunity to create a more equitable and sustainable economy. And that, in line with the Paris Agreement, as you see here, companies must consider the needs and livelihoods of workers and local communities in their climate transition plans. A company that doesn't manage relationships with workforce and community is really facing long-term value risks. And investors are looking for companies to demonstrate that they're proactively planning to manage those risks, to protect long-term value, and mitigate potential disruptions to the sector and the economy, as well as ensure that livelihoods are maintained for workers and communities. What does this actually look like? Much of this discussion so far has been about the energy transition, rightly so, and what the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy means for workers and communities. So for example, back in 2020, Ceres released practices for just, equitable, and sustainable development of clean energy resources. Next slide. But the food sector is undergoing a transition as well to create a food system that's lower emissions as well as resilient to climate change. And through the Ceres Food Emissions 50 initiative, investors are engaging food companies on improving their greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, setting ambitious emission reduction targets, and implementing climate transition plans in line with the Paris Agreement. Back in May of 2022, we released guidance for developing transition plans in this sector. And today we're building on that, releasing a new report that extends that guidance with the goal of addressing a really important component of the just transition in this sector, which is risks to farmers and farm workers, both in the US and throughout global supply chains. So farmers and farm workers, it goes without saying, I think, are absolutely critical to this sector. There is no food system without them. There is no food without them. And what we're going to discuss today is why it's so important that companies prioritize the health, safety, and livelihoods of farmers and farm workers in their transition plans, how they can begin to do so, and when investors can begin bringing into their climate engagements with food companies. Next slide. One key message from the report that we're releasing today is that the just transition in this sector isn't just about the transition to a lower emissions food system. It's also about the transition to a more resilient food system. And farmers and farm workers face both physical risks from climate change itself, as well as transition risks. In other words, potential unintended consequences of efforts to adapt to or mitigate climate change. Next slide. In terms of physical risks, rising temperatures are already creating hazardous conditions for farmers and farm workers. In the US, for example, farm workers are already 20 times more likely to die from extreme heat than other outdoor workers, in part due to a wage structure that discourages breaks. And outdoor workers could be exposed to 4 times as many days with temperatures higher than 38 degrees C or 100 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. In the tropics and subtropics, farmers and farm workers could experience dangerous heat for the majority of the year by 2100. So this creates real health impacts. Additionally, due to climate change, we're seeing reduced crop yields and geographic shifts in crop suitability, which also threaten the livelihoods of farmers and farm workers, especially those who might lack the tools, expertise, land, or water resources to shift to a different crop or to irrigate an existing crop and to adapt to climate change. Next slide. At the same time, agricultural production and agriculturally driven deforestation or commodity driven deforestation are responsible for most emissions from the food sector. And in order to achieve climate targets, food companies are tackling these emissions, and they will need to. And they require substantial shifts in the products that companies are sourcing, where they're sourcing them from, and how those products are being produced. And those shifts bring both opportunities and challenges. So for example, some companies are increasing plant-based offerings in response to shifting consumer preferences and in part to reduce emissions from animal agriculture. This could create new markets for legume crops or even opportunities to produce cultured meat in bioreactors at the farm level. At the same time, some climate smart practices like precision agriculture or even regenerative farming, while often profitable, have some upfront costs or ongoing costs that may be out of reach for some farmers. And this shift to less emission-intensive sourcing, depending on how it's carried out, may either alleviate or reinforce existing inequalities by privileging wealthier farmers who have the resources to manage those costs and the potential risks of new technologies. Next slide. It goes without saying that there's a moral case for addressing these risks and for addressing these inequalities, and for aiming for a transition that alleviates rather than exacerbates those inequities. And there's an economic case as well. So just for example, extreme heat is already threatening to worsen worker shortages and labor-intensive supply chains in the US. And as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, threats to worker safety can severely disrupt supply chains, as the closure of US meat packing plants due to the spread of COVID led to severe shortages of meat products. And those of you who remember the meat shortages back in 2020 and 2021. And a transition to lower emission production that doesn't prioritize the health and livelihoods of farmers and farm workers can not only be a source of reputational risk, it also undermines support for the transition itself if it weakens rather than strengthens rural economies. That would make it harder for companies to meet their climate targets and address the systemic risk of climate change. So it's not just about specific risk to companies, it's also addressing systemic risks within the food system. Next slide. So what can companies do about it, and how can investors engage with them? So I want to say up front that this is a nascent area of engagement, and we don't have all the answers, as you'll hear during the discussion. Nobody does, but we don't have to start from scratch. The principles in this sector are the same as for transition planning in other sectors. And the recommendations in the report we're releasing today were structured around frameworks from the Ceres roadmap, the Climate Action 100 Just Transition Beta Indicator, which were informed by leading international policy documents, including the Paris Agreement, the ILO's Just Transition Guidelines, and developed in consultation with global topic experts and investors. So those principles are to understand and formally acknowledge the risks and commit to address them, to develop and disclose a plan to address them, to ensure just process in addition to just outcomes. In other words, to develop the plan in consultation and social dialogue with affected workers and communities, and to track and disclose in progress. That being said, the specifics of how this is implemented are quite different given the nature of supply chains, the people involved, and the report discusses some of the specific components food companies may consider incorporating into their plans, such as sharing the cost of the transition to climate smart practices or ensuring sufficient farm worker protections within supply chains. And given the varied nature of global supply chains, this will look very different in different places. So enough from me. Let's bring our panelists on to dive into some of the details of this. So today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. AnnaMaria Lobo-Guerrero, who, as I said, is Research Director of Climate Action for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, or CIAT. In this position, AnnaMaria provides strategic leadership of the Alliance's Climate Action Research Program to mainstream climate action in food systems for adaptation and mitigation. AnnaMaria is from Colombia and now based in Rome. She holds a master's and PhD of economics from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has more than 14 years experience working on climate challenges. She was also the head of global policy research for the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, where she played a major role in leadership on partnerships and capacity for scaling climate smart agriculture. Marybeth Gallagher is Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments. She is an attorney and former executive director of a nonprofit organization representing institutional investors and has been advancing social justice and human rights issues for most of her professional career. Marybeth is responsible for leading Domini's engagement efforts with portfolio companies, broader stakeholder groups, and policymakers, as well as developing initiatives and campaigns in areas such as human rights, climate change mitigation, deforestation, health, and racial justice. She represents Domini on the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation Advisory Board. Prior to joining in 2021, she was the executive director of the nonprofit organization Investor Advocates for Social Justice. In that role, she represented institutional investors in stewardship and shareholder advocacy. So we have a wealth of experience with us this morning. So starting with you, Marybeth, one thing that you have mentioned that is really important to understand in this sector is that the challenge of adapting to climate change and reducing emissions is layered on top of a variety of other challenges for farmers and farm workers. What are some of those challenges?
Thanks so much, Marilyn. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today. Thank you to Ceres for organizing this, and more importantly, for your work on integrating just transition into climate transition plan works. As you implied in the question, we are not starting from scratch in a work environment that leaves workers with the protections they need. A lot of what I'll share is context specific or maybe related to the US, not globally, but I think I've had the benefit over the last several years to meet with farm worker organizations connected to our shareholder advocacy and offer a lot of gratitude to groups like that who have shared their experience and helped investors better understand what changes are needed from companies. So groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and Migrant Justice, poultry farm workers have informed some of my understanding of this context. But I guess to start with, really, the whole point of this is putting farmers and farm workers at the center of the solutions. But just to give a snapshot, and some of this is from the US, there are approximately 2.4 million farm workers. About 68% of them are foreign born. So we're talking largely about an immigrant population. And a lot of this contributes to the vulnerability that farm workers face. I'd say the most severe risk workers are exposed to is that of forced labor. workers are forced to be in a job situation overrun by coercion and force, not free to leave their employment. This is not a relic of the past. There is an Operation Bloomin' Onion forced labor racketeering case that the Department of Justice just prosecuted, where tens of thousands of farm workers were forcibly brought to farms in the Southeast United States and working against their will. So the issue of forced labor is a real risk for farmers and farm workers. In addition, it's back-breaking, difficult work, long hours, out exposed to heat and conditions. It's often seasonal, so workers are not working with the same kind of reliability of regular hours, regular work practices. It's often work that's low wage. Approximately more than half of workers earn less than $20,000 a year in the United States. So we're talking about poverty, people who are living in poverty, and often not in a position of power to negotiate on the terms of employment or how they're treated. And that power imbalance, I think, is really fundamental to this question of just transition, sort of who is at the table, how are they represented, how are they advocating for their rights. Often for women workers, so I'd say about a third, this is based on data from the Department of Labor, a third of farm workers are women, and they may be at greater risk of sexual harassment, sexual exploitation, and gender-based violence. So layering on kind of intersectional vulnerabilities for migrant workers and workers who are women. We also talk about the fear of retaliation. So oftentimes workers are brought to a farm by some kind of contractor who dictates the terms of their employment, whether they have employment. And I think some of these conditions leave workers less able to advocate for their rights. In the US, National Labor Relations Act does not apply to farm workers. There are some states that allow workers freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, but generally these workers are unable to form a union to collectively bargain for their rights, which makes sort of these host of challenges even more difficult. And we talk about the working conditions, so whether people have access to water, restrooms, protection from heat, protection from severe weather, in the midst of climate change, whether it's increasing heat or forest fires that are affecting air quality, just thinking of environmental health and safety, even exposure to pesticides. So we're talking about a group of workers already quite vulnerable and already exposed to difficult conditions. That being said, data shows that these workers often have been at their jobs on average for 17 years. So we're talking about skilled workers with expertise and really a lot to bring to the table when we're talking about developing solutions that work. So that's a little snapshot.
Thanks so much, Marybeth. So that was especially helpful, I think, for a US perspective. And AnnaMaria, you've done a great deal of work with smallholders who are involved in commodity supply chains globally, especially in the tropics. So sort of similar question, what are some of the existing challenges for those farmers? And then what do those challenges look like under a changing climate?
Thank you very much, Meryl, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this session, which I think that it's fantastic and it's really interesting, the topics that we are discussing right now. So in relation to smallholder farmers in the developing world, I think that many of the challenges that Marybeth already mentioned, they stand for the smallholder farmers, but perhaps I would like to highlight 6 of them that are really, really relevant for the discussion taking place right now. The first one is that in many occasions, there is a lack of access to appropriate inputs, and especially to seeds. So having the right seeds, it's challenging for many smallholder farmers, and therefore not having the right seeds implies having lower productivities and yields. So I think that that's one of the important challenges that smallholders face, and this is combined with lack of a strong extension and innovation systems at the national level. And these are the systems that are the responsibility is to bring this technology to smallholder farmers, and therefore, through the implementation of these technologies, improving yields, combined with having the right appropriate skills. And that's also what we are experiencing many times, is that these innovations that can help to increase productivity for these smallholder farmers, many times the farmers do not have the right skills to implement these innovations, and this combined with not very strong extension systems in the country make this more challenging in the different countries. And then if you see all these, put these things together, then what we are seeing also in many countries in the tropics is big yield gaps. So if these are compared to other type of farmers, what you see is that the yields that these farmers are experiencing are smaller than other ones, the ones that are obtaining other type of farmers. One thing that it's really challenging, and we have seen this in many of the activities and projects that we implement, it's lack of clear property rights, especially in relation to land tenure. And this is also a huge challenge and problem for smallholder farmers in terms of making sure that they are able to implement these technologies that can help to increase yields and productivity. And then looking more into ecosystem services, degraded lands. This is something that is challenging smallholder farmers. Many times the soil that they have to grow their crops is not the most appropriate one. And obviously this is part of experiencing these yield gaps. And this is something that was already mentioned before, but I think that it is very important. So I would emphasize that many times smallholder farmers in the tropics are not aggregated, and therefore their needs and their voices are not heard in terms of really understanding what are their priorities and what to make sure, how to make sure that through policies, through incentives, we are really addressing those challenges that smallholders are facing. So, but now, Marybeth, you asked about climate change and what happens if on top of all these challenges, bottlenecks that I just mentioned, what happens with climate change? And you mentioned in your presentation some of those impacts, that those are the ones that the smallholders are experiencing as well. But what I think that what many of smallholders are experiencing is changes in the type of uncertainty that they need to deal to do simple things, as to decide when to plant, when to apply the water for their crops, when to apply the fertilizers, which varieties to use. And it's not that uncertainty was not there before, but what climate change has been bringing into the picture is that right now, the way that traditionally was smallholders used to predict what was going to be happening in relation to temperature, in relation to precipitation, is not holding anymore. And then you're experiencing all these extreme events, which what we have seen is that each time more, year after year, they are becoming more frequent and more intense. And I'm just thinking about floods and droughts. So this is bringing another layer of uncertainty into these simple decisions, but obviously these decisions have very big implications and impacts in terms of the incomes and livelihoods of these smallholder farmers. The smallholder farmers in the tropics also, most of them do not have irrigation systems. And that means that whenever this variability, this climate variability, that it's represented in terms of the lack of water or excess of precipitation, when these periods come, then they cannot respond in a satisfactory way to these changes in climate. So that's another one of the big challenges that climate change brings into doing agriculture for smallholder farmers. Also, in terms of how to respond to this variability in climate is the lack of access to credit and insurance. So in many cases, smallholder farmers do not have the means to get proper insurance. So whenever, if for instance, the precipitation does not come, and it comes too late, There's no way to get insurance for those cases. And obviously this has drastic implications in the livelihoods of farmers. And finally, and this is more looking not only into the climate variability, but more into the climate change and thinking about 2030 and 2050, the scenarios and the models that we have been working on and assessing, what they are telling us is that in many countries of the world, especially on the tropics, given the climate and environmental conditions, the agricultural systems as we know them are not going to be feasible or possible anymore. So we are seeing crops that are not suitable given these new climate conditions. And this is something that we have been in the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT been documenting and studying a lot, for instance, coffee in Central America. And what we have seen is that according to these climate change scenarios, coffee or the suitability for growing coffee is going up in terms of latitude. And this implies having a smaller amount of land to grow coffee with huge implications for the many livelihoods of the farmers in Central America that depend on that crop. So let me stop there, Meryl, but very happy to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, AnnaMaria. That's super helpful. Yeah, I was going to say one thing that we emphasize in the report is that it's not even just it is an individual risk to individual farmers and farm workers, but it's also a systemic risk to the food system. And it has these broader impacts in terms of crop suitability shifts and where things can be grown. So shifting a little bit to the other side of the equation, which is the need to reduce emissions from agriculture. One thing we discussed in the report is that most emissions from food companies are supply chain emissions, with a large contribution from agricultural production and commodity-driven land use change, both in the US and globally. What are some of the challenges that farmers, writ large, face in adopting some of the practices that could reduce those emissions?
So, so you already alluded to some of those, Meryl, in your presentation, and I think that and I want to focus on that because it's very significant in terms of what main bottlenecks for implementing these practices, and a lot of them have very high upfront investments that usually, especially smallholders, do not have, and do not have the means of or the liquidity to put their money into this kind of the implementation of these technologies, especially when they are implementing this for the first time. And just to bring a little bit of be more concrete about the specific examples, just think about, for instance, agroforestry and silvopastoral systems. So we know that livestock, it's one of the main contributors through methane of greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the solutions that has been piloted and trying to implement it in many different countries of the world, it's these silvopastoral systems, which is basically to combine livestock with trees, or the same thing, agroforestry, which is basically to combine crops with trees. And in the models that we write, this is an ideal world, because with the trees, you are capturing carbon, and then you are also having some benefits in terms of ecosystem services, also for the health of the animals, and so on and so forth. In practice, it has been very challenging to implement. And I'm come from Colombia, and we have been trying to scale up these silvopastoral systems for almost a decade. And it's still challenging. And the reason, and there have been many studies for that, the reason that it's challenging is because this implies that you need to put some money into these new technologies, planting the trees, and then there's going to be a period of time where you are not going to see the returns from these investments, in terms of, trees get a little bit of time to grow, and then you get your incomes from that. So that means that this needs to be subsidized and things like that. So all these challenges need to be taken into account when we are thinking about these solutions, which I believe that are possible, but we need to incorporate this enabling environment for being able to implement those. And it's not only about the investments, the upfront investments, but also it's considering challenges in relation to cultural dynamics, social, political, and in some cases, implementing these technologies implies doing things in a very different way than, for instance, livestock keepers used to do it in Colombia, as the example that I was just bringing to your attention. So this includes very much moving from an extensive livestock system to an intensive one. And that implies there's a lot in terms of how do people perceive land and therefore the use of the same land. But this is just to say, and to summarize, Meryl, it's just to say that there are very interesting technologies that can help to reduce emissions in the agricultural sector, but there needs to be a deep understanding of everything that it's around in terms of implementation, the local context, so how cultural, political, social, and economic dynamics play a role into making sure that these technologies can be successfully implemented. If we consider these conditions, I think that we have a very high chance of really being able to implement these options that can help us to reduce emissions at the same time that we can build resilience.
Thanks so much, AnnaMaria. So Marybeth, so we have this context where we know there are existing challenges that farmers and farm workers are facing. We're layering climate change on top of that. And then there's this need to also, shift practices to reduce emissions. Why does this matter for food companies? So from an investor perspective, why do these potential impacts and challenges at the farm level pose a risk to food companies?
Thanks. I think we've heard a lot about the different pieces, and Ceres has written about the need for companies in this sector to make a transition to sustainable and regenerative practices, and we need to bring the whole system along. So from our perspective, we're looking at companies that are well equipped to make the transition. And this means reducing their emissions significantly, investing in, through their capital expenditures, the solutions that AnnaMaria was just talking about, both within their direct operations and within their supply chain, so they can meet the expectations that regulations and investors and society is really calling for addressing the climate crisis. But they can't do that alone because of the dependence of food and beverage companies on the farmers and farm workers in their supply chain. So I think this issue is really about where the transformation of the sector is going to happen, and it's local, it's place-based, and it's highly dependent upon suppliers. And so for us, we see companies, for example, making a commitment to a certain percentage of supply being from regenerative agriculture, which is terrific. We need that. That's part of their climate plan, but it raises a lot of questions. Like, how do you know your suppliers are prepared for that transition? How are you incentivizing them? How are you supporting them? Are you investing with them or supporting them for the long term, so that period of adjustment that AnnaMaria just spoke about is supported, that there's reliability and consistency of contracts. So a farmer doesn't invest in technology and then their corporate buyer leaves them with the bill and not with a marketplace to sell their products. So I think just thinking about the cohesion of the transformation and making sure there's alignment of interests here, because farm workers have expertise, farmers have inputs and expertise, and the companies are dependent on that for their climate transition. And so just connecting some more of these dots so that as a company announces, for example, a commitment to address deforestation in their supply chain, how are they ensuring that the local economies that are dependent on like soy or palm plantations that we know need to be managed differently, those local economies are not left behind? And I think it's important because it also removes one of the great barriers that can slow down progress if there's opposition. If a community doesn't see themselves and their needs represented as solutions are being developed, they may be opposed to the transition and sort of not be at the table helping create a system that's sustainable and equitable. So I think it presents a real opportunity to sort of solve for these intersectional challenges around livelihoods, the cost and quality of food, the health, access to nutrition, and really thinking more about the system we're seeking to create.
Yeah, all really great points. When we've spoken about this topic before, you've mentioned how important it is that, oh, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I wanted to ask, Dominique is both a signatory to both Climate Action 100 and Food Emissions 50. So you're engaging with companies in a wide variety of sectors on just transition issues. how are those engagements different, for example, in the utilities or transportation sectors than for companies in the food sector?
Thanks. That's really key. I think this notion of just transition is universal. So that's one thing that's shared, and it's emergent for, I think, everyone sort of figuring out how to bring everyone along so nobody is left behind. But I think there are two key differentiators for food and beverage versus like utilities, where we're thinking of like a coal-fired power plant transitioning to renewable energy, or automotive, where we're moving away from fuel combustion engines towards electrified engines. And the distinctions here are dependent. So the food and beverage companies are dependent upon their supply chains for making those changes happen, compared with a company whose direct operations are changing. And then the relationship of needing to incentivize, invest in, and support the farmers and farm workers is different than a company spending its own CapEx, for example, on closing down a coal-fired plant and building new renewable arrays to get solar panel energy. So thinking about sort of the investments being company-owned versus supply chain-owned. And that shifts sort of where the conversations within a company are likely to be happening. So it may be more within the department, like procurement or supply chain risk management, that these conversations are taking place, as opposed to systems planning with a utility. I'd say another dimension of the utility engagements has really been the relationship with labor unions and the importance of sort of bringing workers along and prioritizing high road jobs. So a lot of the fossil fuel jobs have often been union labor with strong wage protections, good ability to bargain for healthcare benefits and long-term stability. And there's been a concern that as jobs transition from fossil fuel to clean energy, that there won't be that same role for the unions to play. So that's, I think, a distinction here where workers aren't as collectively organized or represented. And I think that could sort of diffuse the conversation and make it even more important that each company is really looking closely at their own supply chain and their own relationships with farmers and farm workers.
Yeah, that's really important, the differing nature of labor in this sector. So in terms of what companies can do about this and what investors expect, what are your expectations as an investor for how food companies start to address these dual impacts of climate change and the transition to a lower emission food system on farmers and farm workers?
So I think from our perspective, the first question is really like, how big is this issue and how big is the problem? So really scoping, like what changes are needed where? Are you changing your like key suppliers? Are you changing the smallholder farmers you're working with? Are you changing where you're sourcing from? And sort of mapping on that people layer to that scenario planning and mapping of risks and impacts. So who will be impacted and how? And a lot of that will require increased transparency and into the supply chain or into supplier relationships, just to map sort of if a region that is now exposed to drought needs to, supply needs to shift because a farming region is now exposed to drought, is not as productive, sort of what does that mean? Are those same workers able to move to a new location, or are you working with a different supplier? And in what I shared at the outset, that it's often sort of contingent workers or workers who have sort of unstable relationships with their employers, or how do you keep those same workers who are looking for a job employed? So I think there are a lot of questions just in terms of scoping and defining the problem, and then understanding who will be impacted and how. Some of this will be positive. There will be innovations and opportunities for upskilling and reskilling for the role that technology and innovation will play, but there will also be changes to wages and skills and job stability. And I think the degree to which the business model is changing will really shift for different companies. And we need sort of an understanding that a company is even thinking about the human dimension of this and ensuring that sort of no one is left behind. And really there's a question of fairness at the heart of this. Who's bearing the cost for the transition and who's benefiting from the opportunities that it will bring? And how are we tapping into that expertise that's really well equipped to help smooth the pathway forward?
Yeah, I think that leads really into the next question about fairness, because one thing that we've talked about is it's not just a fair outcome, it's the process of how you're getting there. And you've mentioned how important it is that companies develop their transition plans in consultation with the people and communities that will be affected, and that informs some of the recommendations in the report. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like, what that could look like?
Yeah, so the ILO guidelines on a just transition talk about this notion of social dialogue. So like bringing everyone along who is at the table. So who is represented? Are workers represented? Are large scale farmers or small scale farmers? Sort of the whole different array of people that will be impacted in different ways. And then there are communities. So we know there's a whole ecosystem around a farm, literal and figurative, of suppliers and people who support industry, who support the work of producing food and getting it to market, and thinking about sort of who will be impacted and how, and making sure that broad range of stakeholders, from local communities to employers to the people who support in ancillary ways, like in the utility sector, for example. We've heard companies talk about the restaurants that are affected when a plant shuts down and there's no longer workers who are there. So thinking about sort of that array, and even if the tax base of a community is affected, that community government is represented, and thinking about replacing that revenue if there are supply chain shifts. So part of this is just making sure everyone is at the table and there are pathways for people to have their voice heard, and then someone at the company who's bringing this information into the just transition and scenario planning.
Thanks. AnnaMaria, in your experience working on agricultural resilience and climate change mitigation with farmers, you've also mentioned that type of consultation is really important. Could you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that besides from what Marybeth said already, which is very important to have everybody on the table and being able to hear their voices, which is very, very important from a social equity perspective. Besides that, consultations are key, because all these solutions that we are promoting are very context specific. And sometimes, or I would say many times, things that work under some circumstances do not work under other circumstances. And therefore, the importance of really understanding what are the needs, what are the main challenges. It's key and fundamental to make sure that these technologies that we are proposing are going to be able to achieve the goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of increasing resilience, reducing climate risks. So if we don't engage into these type of consultations, and we have seen that in the implementation of projects, it could be the case that you're just working really hard to promote something that we believe that could really help in terms of addressing these objectives, but it's at the end of the day, what we see is that the results do not show that. And that's because we are missing part of the story. And being able to do not miss part of this story, it's having good and honest consultation processes. But also, another component that it's very important in terms of these local consultations is to make sure that there's sustainability into these options that we believe that are relevant to implement for these smallholder farmers. And sustainability only comes when the communities that are implementing these options are really empowered in terms of the implementation and have the right capacity to continue processes beyond the life of the projects that we are engaged with. So it's really making sure that these communities are the leaders of these things, that they understand why are they benefiting from that, and that somehow they guide the way of implementing this, so that it's really, they are really benefiting, and they're seeing what's the value added of implementing these options and these technologies. And for that, consultations are very, very important, because they help a lot in the process. As you mentioned, Meryl, this is also, it's not only the objective, but it's how to get to that objective. So in the process, we help in terms of this empowerment and making sure that communities own these processes and that they want to continue implementing these.
Thanks, AnnaMaria. So back to you, Marybeth. Beyond just having a commitment to a just transition, what are some of the concrete things that food companies should be thinking about to address climate transition impacts on farmers and farm workers?
Yeah, I think this conversation brings together a lot of different functional roles within a company. And like the main thing to know is that all those different parts of a company are thinking about this in a connected way or an intersectional way. So like a just transition task force is something we've encouraged other companies to establish, and that would have someone with like climate expertise, supply chain expertise, procurement, someone from personnel or human resources, that can establish expectations and help a company to really understand the different implications of the transition throughout their business and throughout their business relationships. Another second piece is really to acknowledge the power dynamics that are at play here and the vulnerabilities that farmers and farm workers face as with this uncertainty and the level of investment that they are looking to undertake. And then thinking really concretely about the shifts that are needed and mapping them over a timeline. So let's say you're an animal agriculture company and you see the pressures for decreased consumption of meat or declining consumer demand for meat-based products. What is the trajectory of that changing demand over time? And what will the implications of that shift be for the producers that are currently supplying you? And sort of how do you ensure that those farmers, farm workers, ecosystems of people aren't really left behind? And as new opportunities emerge to fill those consumer demands, that customers, those suppliers are supported. We know it's not easy for like small scale organic farmers to sort of meet the demands of a corporate buyer, and thinking about how do you support through long-term contracts, through like legally binding mechanisms that give a farmer the certainty that if they make that investment, that will pay off in the long term. So really even demonstrating to investors that contracts and supply chain relationships are shifting to accommodate this long-term partnership that's needed between farm workers, farmers, and the food and beverage company, so that the solutions are equitable and really fundamentally taking into account the transformation that's needed, looking at things like the racial equity impacts, the community and wage impacts, and thinking sort of holistically about the solutions. And some of that will come out in a disclosure that's an addendum or a part of a climate transition plan. So I think like all of this stuff needs to be happening within a company, and then somehow stakeholders need to be informed about it. Investors need some level of information, but it's more important that the farmers and farm workers who are most likely to be impacted have that clear channel of communication to address that instability, that anxiety, that uncertainty that's going to be part of this transition, so they can understand their role and responsibility in it as well.
Thanks. So you mentioned disclosures. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted to go to AnnaMaria and ask, on the ground, have you seen examples of supply chain initiatives that were effective in supporting the adoption of climate smart agricultural practices?
Yeah, so we have been working for a while in terms of implementing this climate smart agriculture with communities, smallholders, and this is basically solutions that address at the same time 3 pillars. So making sure that we are contributing to increasing productivity and food security at the same time that we are building this resilience, and at the same time, if possible, that we are contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions or capturing carbon. And perhaps something that I would like to emphasize is that it's the importance, and we have seen a value of researchers getting together with communities and working together in terms of really testing these approaches. So an understanding of what are the bottlenecks, when and under which circumstances are these approaches working or not. And part of that was a lot of work that we did in past years in different regions, Africa, Asia, Latin America, in terms of these climate smart villages work. which was basically delivering research with a variety of stakeholders, including the communities, but also the companies that were part of the value chain. And it was really interesting how, and I'm going back to something that I mentioned earlier in terms of the importance of communities being empowered and owning these processes. So for instance, one concrete example that we did in Cauca, in Colombia, in one of these climate smart villages was we were implementing all these different options, diversification, water harvesting, reducing emissions because of increases in efficiency and the use of compost to fertilize the same farm and things like that. And what we did was that, and this was a region that still grows a lot of coffee. What we did was that we engaged in a project with a company to somehow develop this very unique coffee in terms of telling us the story that was behind that coffee. So it was the story of a farmer that was engaging in these practices, that was doing compost in their farm, that was diversifying, and then working together along the value chain to make sure that this very special coffee that has this history behind it could have a value added in terms of putting that into the market and getting perhaps higher prices for this coffee because of the sustainability and all the story that was behind that. And I think that part of the success of this was that really the communities believed in this, and they thought that they saw that they could do a difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions through implementing these different practices and through perhaps producing a coffee that was different because of all the sustainability behind that. But just to emphasize that this was working together with specific company along the value chain to make sure that all the way from the story of the farmer on her farm was documented all the way until this coffee went into the market.
Thanks so much, AnnaMaria. So one more question for you, Marybeth, and then we'll transition to some Q&A from the audience. What are some of the frameworks that companies can look to in developing their commitments, and what disclosures are you looking for as an investor?
Sure. So this is emergent. There isn't a whole list of best practices to necessarily point companies to, but like you mentioned earlier, automotive and utilities have been thinking about this, and the energy sector. So there's some pieces of information to look from. But the main pillar is the ILO Just Transition Guidelines, and that gives the whole framework of sort of what it means to bring workers and communities along. And then different tools have developed for investors. So one is the World Benchmarking Alliance Just Transition Methodology, and that gives specific indicators of like what kind of information can signal to an investor that a company is thinking about these implications and managing them well. The Climate Action 100 benchmark also has just transition beta indicators that give some information about the kind of disclosure. So I would point people to those sources. And really what you're looking for is, does a company have a just transition strategy? So it doesn't need to have all the answers, but just to say we are committed to not leaving people behind as we make this transition and supporting them through whatever tools we learn from them are necessary. So it might include like the stakeholders who are consulted and how, what's done with the inputs they share, who has governance responsibilities at the board level and through senior management, how stakeholders are incentivized to make the transition alongside a company. So are you investing in upskilling, reskilling, the infrastructure investments that are needed to support farms along the transition, and disclosure that helps sort of paint a picture of how this work fits within the climate transition strategy holistically. So when a company makes a commitment around major shifts that are going to be happening in their agricultural supply chain, you have a sense of sort of who is going to be held accountable, who is going to be supported, and how they're going to make sure those people are not left behind. So it's really around like process planning. And then eventually as this area matures, maybe more of the actual outputs and outcomes of that process. But at this stage, really we're looking for signaling and a commitment, and then disclosures around how it's unfolding.
Thank you, really helpful. So let's transition to some audience Q&A. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can type them into the little Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner. So one question that we have coming in is for Marybeth. So you mentioned that this is a fairly nascent area of engagement. What would be your advice to investors who are just starting to engage on just transition issues with food companies or with other companies for that matter?
Sure. I think there's a lot of shared learning we can do, and there's like thinking about sort of what good practices are. So gathering together through forums that Ceres coordinates, I think can help us share our experiences. To the extent we can go directly to the sources of expertise like farmer organizations, and understand their own priorities and concerns, and then help lift those up into our engagements. And then I think just reading the report that Ceres has put out and sort of digging into some of the materials referenced there. As this space evolves, I think we'll turn to other sectors to understand how they're managing and then sort of model those practices. And we'll need to get coherent on what our expectations are. So companies are hearing consistently from investors, this is what a good just transition strategy looks like. So some of that is ahead of us, but definitely like starting to learn and dig into the issues.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good point about having a coherent voice. So we'll take one more question, which is for AnnaMaria, that, a lot of these disclosures that Marybeth is talking about require collecting a lot of information at the farm level, or a lot of, tracking and monitoring. What's the value of that? Can you talk about why that's important from your experience?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that, and we are working a lot in terms of being more efficient in collecting this information, because we believe that this information is key. I think that I would just highlight two main issues. For instance, the example that I just provided on how we were able to develop these value added for our coffee that was produced using these sustainability measures. It's very important to have documented and to have some specific indicators, either in terms of livelihoods, in terms of social equity, in terms of environmental issues such as reduction of emissions. So if we want to have access to markets, and if we are serious about differentiating this product because of what is behind the product in terms of sustainability, it is important to have the information to back up that, and that's important for markets, and that can provide more value to their products. But also something that is really important, it's everything that we can learn from really tracking and assessing those indicators. And as Marian was mentioning, we have a huge challenge in front of us. We are not starting from zero, but this is very much, we are learning by doing on this, and part of this learning by doing, it's really understanding what are the implications of the things, the technologies, the practices that we are implementing with farmers, and adjusting according to the results that we are seeing. So otherwise, it's really hard to see if we are really achieving our commitments, our targets, and many times we are not already there, and many times this tracking and reporting and making sure that we know what's happening in terms of these key dimensions and these key indicators is where you have all the relevant information to adjust processes and make sure that you can do things better and achieve better your objectives in the following phase of these processes. So just learning, super important to have these indicators, and also for giving more value to the products.
Thanks so much, AnnaMaria. So I think we'll end there with the importance of data, one of my favorite topics. There was one more question that came in. Thank you for answering that, Marybeth. Someone was looking for the links to the transition disclosures and frameworks that you mentioned. So thank you all so much for joining us. A couple last things before we wrap up. Rachel, if you could bring up the slide. So I'd like to remind everyone that Ceres will be back in person, very exciting, for our flagship event, Ceres Global. Registration is open and early bird rates close on February 8th. So register now if you can. We will have a couple sessions related to this issue, one around supplier engagement to tackle scope 3. So make sure you register before February 8th to get that discount. Next slide. So your feedback is important to us, and we'd love to hear, what you thought of this session, what else you want to see, and what other webinars will interest you. So please fill out, you can scan this QR code to complete the evaluation for this session. It's really quick, takes about 5 minutes. So thank you all so much for being with us. A special thanks to Marybeth and AnnaMaria for joining us and sharing your rich experiences and wealth of knowledge. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.